One of the weirdest things you actually have to find out when trying to record videos for the internet is what you actually want to be like. Because every single person you ever had a relationship in your life with just has a certain image of you, and this image will be slightly different, and the image you have of yourself in your mind also is obviously different. So therefore you have to choose one. And now ideally you would basically create a proxy for a relationship, you could say. And what I created in my mind is myself, basically. I am now looking at myself. And so the things that I don't want to hear are not things that I then would tell. So by using yourself as the proxy, you create basically the ultimate judge, because you can judge. You're not talking to 15-year-olds about something. So therefore, having just a good proxy, a good proximate, you could say, basically a simplification algorithm for decision making, allows you to fit yourself into kind of a character. And one other thing that is obviously connected to this thing is how you then portray yourself. I mean, for example, if I record myself in this format, I usually try to have my hands here. This is actually something I recently realized. Instead of having my hands more down here as you would in a normal conversation. But this is not really the case, because this is also not really a normal conversation. Also, of course, in a normal conversation, someone would actually talk back. And one of the weirdest things for me, as not a native English speaker, is the fact that I also have to choose my accent. I mean, what accent do I choose? Usually, nowadays, it's British, especially if I do these kind of videos. If I then talk more casually, I often switch to American English, or I mix them both, or I switch back to my bad accent English. But another thing you also have to try to figure out is, in the realm of how you want to portray yourself, with which voice you're trying to speak. In the beginning, what I try to do is, kind of a short, not history, but in the beginning, I just wrote posts, and then I said, what if I just recorded these posts as kind of a podcast? And for this, I tried to make my best speaker voice, or to use my best speaker voice I could come up with. And this speaker voice only begins to actually materialize, you could say, after my voice is properly trained for a few days. And then my voice, I can just speak deeper very easily, actually. Just like in the last sentence, I actually can speak deeper very easily, actually. So my voice just dropped basically in the last part of the sentence. And if I then speak all the time in this lower voice, then of course now, of course what happens is that the better your voice is actually, the more people would potentially listen to you. But only given the fact that it doesn't sound weird, that it doesn't sound forced. And this is actually what you probably sounded like in the beginning. Why? Because nobody has a perfect speaker voice without properly training it, I guess. So therefore the problem is, which one do you choose? And I think I found kind of the answer. I think I just don't choose. I just record something with the state of mind I am in. So I basically don't really create something, but I just document something. And if this means that I then use a voice that I just have available right now, and don't have a hoarse voice, for example, by maybe not going to a party and screaming 3 hours, then my voice is not as hoarse and then doesn't sound as speaker-like. So right now, for example, I can record this with the things I already have. And I just also began to record these videos on the phone I already have, because that's the thing I already have. And it's not only the thing I already have in my home, but it's also the thing I already have whenever I just have my phone in my pocket. So therefore, instead of trying to create a product, instead of trying to alter what you actually are, which of course you still do, but the closer you have this character you create, the closer it is to actually your current state of mind, your current state maybe of background emotions and so on and so forth, the easier it is actually over time to still be able to record. Because in 10 years, if you then think that the character you created is kind of out of fashion, then of course it can be out of fashion. But the closer it is to you, the less choice you then have actually. So in terms of voice modulation, what I actually now realized is the following. You don't just want to have a very deep voice. You don't just want to have a very high voice, but just like with many other skills, the more bandwidth you actually have, the better. So whenever I want to emphasize something, I can drop my voice. Of course, I don't really do this artificially, or I try not to do it artificially, but much more, it is kind of just a pattern of speaking now. The pattern of speaking that I actually do usually for videos. Of course, this might also just be, or turn out to be, the pattern of speaking I use whenever I talk to friends. But of course, then the level of friendship and the relationship level also influences how you actually talk to someone. And then again, back to the ideal proxy. I mean, ideally, for example, think of you in 10 years. If you in 10 years, of course, given the assumption that you developed at least a little bit, therefore over 10 years are basically better in every single way, apart from your age basically making you more likely not to die at every single second, you are then in 10 years a better person. So if you in 10 years still would watch your videos, which of course then you cannot really judge again. So therefore, of course, 10 years is very far, but what you could instead try to do is take yourself, the current yourself, and not yourself as someone who would watch these videos because he knows the person. But if you actually saw this video on the internet and you would actually see this, would you actually watch it? If it wasn't you, if you didn't have this emotional attachment to creating this or having created this video, would you still watch it? And the same is true for writing, and the same is true for audio. If you yourself wouldn't even watch it, then why would anyone else? Of course, some people might, because, for example, me, 10 years younger, would maybe watch something like this, because it's exactly what I wanted maybe 10 years ago. Someone who is basically like me, just a little bit older, and maybe a little bit more experienced, maybe not, but who has figured out at least some of the things I figured out or wanted to figure out 10 years ago. So basically, right now, I am providing a guide for my 10-year-ago self. The problem only is that you cannot judge this anymore, because you are not that person anymore, and you also cannot really establish this person in your mind anymore. Of course, you could try to speak down in terms of age, but I don't think this creates a standard that is high enough for you. So let's say, for example, let's just take Andrew Tate as an example. He doesn't talk to people who are like 10 years older than him, because otherwise they just wouldn't listen. If the thing you are trying to say wouldn't appeal to somebody who is older than you, of course, assuming that with being older, also being more experienced and so on and so forth. So basically using age as a proxy for how developed you are in your life. Of course, also assuming you don't have any major illnesses that actually then, again, decrease your development. Your net development, you could say. And on the one side, we have someone like him. On the other side, we have someone like Andrew Huberman. And Andrew Huberman, I would say, is one of the best science communicators, at least in terms of neuroscience. He's basically the #1 podcast in terms of neuroscience. He's the go-to podcast, and he has established himself within a time span of 2 or maybe 3 years. And he can do this, he could do this, potentially, because he maybe had mapped it out already, but he also has a very good strategy, and he also probably already taught before. So therefore, the step was not that big. Of course, in his role as a professor at Stanford, he also talks down to people. Not talks down to people in terms of the general meaning, but talks down to people in terms of the age. So then, again, if he assumed the standard of himself being the proxy, would he actually listen to his own conversation? Is, again, a better proxy than would students listen to this, because students obviously have to listen to this. And of course, I mean, students also can be more interested, but that's not what we are trying to aim at. The higher the standard is, the higher your aim is actually, your objective is actually. And I have noticed so many times that once I create a goal, an objective for a higher standard, not necessarily in terms of videos, but just, for example, if I state something like, okay, I actually want to increase my bench press or something like this. And then if I actually have this in my mind, and then I also bring it down to the necessary smaller steps, then my mind begins to work on its own and come up with ideas. This morning, for example, my mind just generated random ideas, like short poems, you could say. Of course, this is not really relevant to this, and I also didn't really think about these beforehand. And also, it was kind of, I tried to actually focus on something else and my mind just came up with it. But now the more you think about these things, and if your goal is, for example, to create, I don't know, 10, 15, 25 of these small written things a day, or it is just to create one video a week, if you state this goal, then the steps just become so much more clear, because you actually then think about what you're actually trying to do. And now, coming back to the beginning, with trying to create the character you are trying to be, basically, to the person that is on the other end of the screen. Of course, you have to choose the level of relationship you want to be. The more vulnerable you are, basically, the higher the state of the relationship. I often refer to how deep a relationship can go in my mind, just from a scale from 1 to 10. So 1 would basically, 0 is a person you don't know. 1 would be a person you maybe got to know once and talk to once. And then it goes on, and 10 is maybe your partner for life. So, of course, your partner for life also doesn't really know you, so maybe 10 maybe either is an ideal that doesn't exist, or it is just you. But of course, you don't really know yourself either. So you would maybe be a 7 or an 8, but just given the fact that you cannot even... I thought about this specific scenario in the morning. Let's say there was a drug that let you actually work for multiple days. Now, what many people would actually do is work for multiple days. And that creates a problem. Why? Because this harms their overall mortality and makes them more likely to die maybe 5 days earlier in the terms of overall lifespan. Because people are just not very good at managing the rest of their body, actually. People are just good in what they perceive to be the things they can do. And maybe often they aren't really good. So the rest is completely managed by the subconscious. And now by creating a proxy, by creating an objective, and by creating this relationship proxy, you could say, because it is more or less a relationship, then what actually becomes more and more clear, at least in your subconscious mind, and also in your conscious mind, is what you actually have to do. And the better the proxy. And another person, I think, is just one of the best proxies we have, because we have all the different things that actually make us do things, like comparing ourselves to others. I actually recently, also kind of along these lines, created a list with all the people I would like to know that I then would compare myself to. And since, for example, there are not that many people I know that are actually creating videos for the internet, I just took people that I already consume, basically, or I consume their content, and then maybe of the same age, and then I can just compare myself to these people. And therefore, these people now act as proxies for the standard of how many things I would create. And if a person, for example, has figured something out, then the chances that you can also figure it out, given maybe, of course, varying levels of maybe resources in terms of maybe different things like financial resources and so on and so forth. Of course, no proxy is ideal. Therefore, you, just better, is maybe the best proxy you could ever have. But this is also something that is hard to imagine. Therefore, maybe you, as you currently are, is the best proxy you could possibly come up with.